The Hippodrome of Constantinople erupts in flames as 30,000 corpses fill the racing grounds, their blood soaking into the ancient stone where cheering crowds once celebrated chariot victories. Emperor Justinian the First huddles in his palace, moments from fleeing his capital forever. When a single general steps forward with an unthinkable proposal, he will march his handful of loyal soldiers directly into that human inferno and restore order through systematic slaughter. His name is Belisarius, and in this moment of imperial desperation, he becomes the instrument through which Rome's final great military resurgence and its darkest moral compromises will be written in blood across 3 continents. The Eastern Roman Empire that Justinian inherited in 527 existed as a shadow of its former glory. While barbarian kingdoms ruled the West from the ruins of classical civilization, Constantinople stood as the last beacon of Roman continuity, wealthy beyond measure yet strategically paralyzed. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, had fractured into competing spheres. Vandal pirates controlled North Africa from Carthage, Ostrogothic kings administered Italy from Ravenna, and Visigothic monarchs held Spain. The empire's survival depended on diplomacy, tribute, and the careful management of Persian aggression along the eastern frontier. Justinian's vision transcended mere survival. This emperor, born a Latin-speaking Illyrian peasant, possessed an obsessive determination to restore Rome's former territorial glory and impose religious orthodoxy across Christendom. His wife Theodora, a former actress of scandalous reputation, wielded equal influence from the shadows of the imperial purple. Together they dreamed not of managing decline, but engineering resurrectional project requiring military genius, boundless resources, and moral flexibility that would test the limits of Christian conscience. Belisarius emerged from the same Thracian peasant stock as his emperor, a military prodigy whose tactical brilliance first manifested during the Persian Wars by 530. At approximately 25 years of age, he had already distinguished himself in border conflicts, demonstrating an uncanny ability to achieve victory against superior numbers through deception, mobility, and the calculated exploitation of enemy weakness. His loyalty to Justinian appeared absolute, his ambitions seemingly limited to military glory rather than political power qualities that made him invaluable yet ultimately vulnerable in the paranoid calculus of imperial politics. The Nika riots that brought Belisarius's terrible opportunity stemmed from Constantinople's toxic fusion of sports factionalism, religious controversy, and economic grievance. The city's population divided fanatically between the blues and greens. Chariot racing factions that functioned as political parties, street gangs, and social identities simultaneously. When Justinian's tax policies inflamed existing tensions, and his religious persecution alienated monophysite Christians, these circus factions transformed into revolutionary mobs. They proclaimed a rival emperor, besieged the palace, and seemed poised to overthrow Justinian's regime entirely. According to the historian Procopius, who served as Belisarius's secretary and later betrayer through his scandalous secret history, the emperor prepared ships for evacuation when Theodora delivered her legendary speech. She would rather die in imperial purple than live as a refugee. Her defiance catalyzed Justinian's decision to unleash Belisarius and his fellow general Mundus with instructions that obliterated any distinction between security operation and massacre. The generals divided their forces, sealed the hippodrome's exits, and methodically butchered the trapped crowds. Estimates of the dead ranged from 30,000 to 50,000 soulsmen, women and children, guilty of nothing more than presence in the wrong place when imperial survival required blood sacrifice. This massacre established the moral template for everything that followed. Belisarius had proven he would commit any atrocity in service to Justinian's vision. The emperor now possessed a weapon of terrifying efficiency, a general who combined tactical genius with unquestioning obedience. Within months, Justinian would unleash this weapon against Rome's ancient enemies, beginning a reconquest that would temporarily restore imperial frontiers while draining the empire's resources, devastating ancient cities, and ultimately accelerating the very decline it sought to reverse. 15,000 soldiers board transport ships in Constantinople's harbor, equipped for an expedition that military advisors universally condemned as suicidal folly. The Vandal kingdom of North Africa had endured for nearly a century, its Germanic warriors legendary for ferocity, its navy dominant across Mediterranean shipping lanes. Previous Roman attempts at reconquest had ended in catastrophic failure. Yet Justinian gambled his treasury and reputation on this expedition, and Belisarius gambled his life, because both men understood that symbolic victories mattered more than strategic logic in the economy of imperial restoration. The timing reflected calculated opportunism rather than principled justice. King Helderic of the Vandals, a Roman-friendly ruler who maintained peaceful relations with Constantinople, been overthrown by his cousin Gelamor, a Vandal nationalist who rejected Roman pretensions and reasserted Germanic independence. Justinian seized this succession crisis as pretext for intervention, claiming to restore a legitimate monarch while actually pursuing territorial conquest. The hypocrisy was transparent to contemporaries, but irrelevant to an emperor who measured legitimacy by results rather than principles. Belisarius's invasion force represented a microcosm of Roman identity's evolution. His heavy cavalry, the cataphracts who formed his military corpus, ended from Hun and Sarmatian traditions rather than classical legions. His infantry included Isaurian mountaineers, Armenian auxiliaries, and barbarian federates, fighting under Roman standards. His personal retinue, the Belisariii, household troops bound to him by personal loyalty and payment, operated outside traditional military structures entirely. This mongrel army fought under Roman eagles, but reflected the empire's fundamental transformation from Mediterranean city-state to multi-ethnic autocracy held together by imperial personality rather than civic institutions. The invasion proceeded with shocking efficiency that revealed Vandal vulnerability. Belisarius landed unopposed at Caput Vada in modern Tunisia, marched overland toward Carthage while his fleet paralleled the coast, and encountered Gelamor's main force at Ad Decimum, 10 miles from the capital. The battle demonstrated Belisarius's tactical sophistication. He used his cavalry's superior discipline to shatter Vandal charges, employed feigned retreats to draw enemies into killing zones, and personally led decisive counterattacks at critical moments. Gelamor's brother died in the fighting, breaking Vandal morale and sending their king fleeing inland. Carthage fell without siege in September 533, its ancient harbors and granaries intact, its population celebrating liberation from Vandal taxation and Arian heresy. Belisarius entered the city to discover a feast prepared for Gelamor's victory celebration, symbolically consuming the meal intended for his defeated enemy. For a brief moment, Roman authority returned to the city Scipio Aemilianus had destroyed 7 centuries earlier, and which Augustine had defended against barbarian siege. Justinian's propagandists celebrated this restoration as divine vindication, evidence that God favored Roman orthodoxy over Germanic heresy. Yet reconquest proved simpler than consolidation. Gelamor rallied Vandal loyalists and Moorish tribal allies, initiating guerrilla warfare that disrupted Roman supply lines and demonstrated the difference between defeating an army and controlling a territory. The decisive confrontation came at Tricomarum in December 533, where Belisarius again shattered Vandal formations through superior cavalry tactics and personal courage. Contemporary accounts, including those preserved in Procopius's official Wars of Justinian, describe Belisarius charging directly into enemy lines, his purple-plumed helmet marking him as priority target, while simultaneously inspiring his troops through visible leadership that recalled legendary commanders from Rome's Republican past. Gelamor fled to Mount Papua in the Atlas Range, where Moorish tribesmen sheltered him through winter until starvation and despair broke his resistance. He surrendered in March 534, subsequently paraded through Constantinople in a triumph that consciously mimicked ancient Roman victory celebrations. Justinian granted the defeated king estates and honors, demonstrating the magnanimity of power, while simultaneously humiliating him through forced participation in ceremonies proclaiming Roman superiority. Africa appeared secured within 18 months, its conquest achieved at minimal cost and maximum propaganda value. Belisarius returned to Constantinople as the empire's greatest living general, showered with honors, wealth, and imperial favor. Neither he nor his emperor yet understood how their African success would encourage far more catastrophic adventures, or how victory's ease masked underlying weaknesses that would transform triumph into tragedy. The Gothic War begins not with trumpets and declarations, but with a letter queen Amalisantha of the Ostrogoths, granddaughter of Theodoric the Great, writes desperately to Constantinople seeking protection from Gothic nobles plotting her overthrow. Justinian sees opportunity where others might see obligation. Italy, the heartland of classical Rome, might be recovered through the same combination of pretense and force that delivered Africa. He dispatches Belisarius with explicit instructions to transform what appears as protective intervention into permanent conquest, making the general complicit in a deception that will consume the next 2 decades and destroy Italian prosperity for generations. The Ostrogothic kingdom represented the most successful barbarian state in the former Western Empire. Theodoric the Great had ruled from Ravenna with Roman administrative sophistication, preserving classical culture, maintaining aqueducts and public buildings, and employing Roman senators in governance. His kingdom functioned as de facto Roman restoration under Germanic management. More stable and prosperous than the empire's own territories in many respects. By 535, however, succession disputes and religious tensions between Arian Gothic rulers and Catholic Roman populations created vulnerabilities that Justinian ruthlessly exploited. Belisarius invaded Sicily with minimal resistance in late 535, then crossed to mainland Italy in 536. Initial Gothic disarray allowed rapid Roman advances. Naples fell after brutal siege. Rome itself opened its gates in December 536, surrendering to imperial forces without the battle that might have destroyed its ancient monuments. For a brief moment, the political heart of the classical world returned to Roman control, and Justinian's vision of restoration seemed divinely ordained rather than strategically delusional. The Gothic reaction transformed swift conquest into generational catastrophe. King Witiges rallied Gothic armies and besieged Rome from March 537 to March 538. Surrounding Belisarius's garrison in a siege that inverted the expedition's logic, the conquerors became the trapped. The liberators became devourers of the population they claimed to rescue. Belisarius demonstrated his defensive genius through sorties that disrupted Gothic siege works, cavalry raids that interdicted enemy supplies, and propaganda that maintained Roman morale despite hunger and disease. He held Rome through determination that bordered on obsession, refusing to abandon the city that symbolized everything Justinian's restoration project claimed to represent. Yet holding Rome required destroying it. Aqueducts severed by Gothic forces remained unrepaired, depriving the city of water that sustained urban life since Augustus. The population, possibly 500,000 during classical peak, had already declined to perhaps 100,000 by Justinian's reign. The Gothic Wars would reduce it further to perhaps 30,000 by the century's end. According to estimates preserved in papal records, ancient monuments suffered systematic damage as both sides fortified positions, mined materials, and prioritized military necessity over cultural preservation. The city that Belisarius saved existed increasingly as symbol rather than functioning metropolis. The siege lifted in 538 when Belisarius's relief force threatened Gothic supply lines. But the war metastasized into a grinding attrition conflict that spread devastation across the Italian peninsula. Witiges fell back to Ravenna, initiating a new siege that lasted from 539 to 540. During this siege, Belisarius received perhaps the most remarkable proposal of his career: the Gothic nobles, exhausted by war and recognizing Witiges' inadequacy, offered to make Belisarius himself king of Italy if he would accept Gothic service and abandon Justinian. The offer revealed the desperation of all parties. Goths saw in Belisarius the strong leader Witiges failed to be. Romans in Italy recognized that Gothic rule had often proven more beneficial than imperial taxation. Belisarius himself faced the temptation of kingship, the possibility of carving a realm from the chaos he had helped create. According to Procopius, the general feigned acceptance to gain entry into Ravenna, then arrested Witiges and claimed the city for Justinian in May 540. Whether this represented loyalty or cowardice, wisdom or wasted opportunity, remains debated by historians. Certainly it demonstrated that Belisarius, however brilliant in tactics, lacked either the ambition or courage to transcend his role as imperial instrument. Belisarius returns to Constantinople, bearing the captured Gothic king. expecting triumph but receiving suspicion. Justinian's paranoia, carefully stoked by jealous courtiers and the emperor's own insecurities, transforms military success into political liability. The general who had conquered 2 kingdoms in 8 years suddenly faced accusations of disloyalty. Whispers that he had seriously considered the Gothic crown, insinuations that his growing legend threatened imperial supremacy. The relationship between emperor and general, never based on trust, but rather on mutual utility, began its long dissolution into mutual resentment. The pattern of Belisarius's remaining career traces a tragic arc of diminishing returns and squandered genius. Justinian dispatched him to the Persian frontier in 541, as King Khosrow I broke the eternal peace and invaded Roman Syria. Belisarius achieved defensive successes, but lacked resources for decisive victory. Forced to conduct economy of force operations while Justinian simultaneously prosecuted the still unresolved Italian conflict. The two-front war exposed the fundamental flaw in Justinian's restoration project. The empire lacked the resources to sustain simultaneous major campaigns, forcing a constant robbing of Peter to pay Paul that prevented consolidation of any single conquest. Italy collapsed into renewed chaos during Belisarius's Persian deployment. King Totila, a Gothic leader of genuine military talent and charismatic appeal, rallied Gothic resistance and systematically reversed Roman gains between 541 and 544. Unlike previous Gothic commanders, Totila combined military skill with propaganda genius, offering religious tolerance, land redistribution, and protection to Italian peasants suffering under Roman taxation. His success revealed an uncomfortable truth. Many Italians preferred Gothic rule to Roman liberation, seeing imperial reconquest as disaster rather than restoration. Justinian reluctantly recalled Belisarius to Italy in 544. It sent him inadequately resourced, perpetually reinforced with insufficient forces that reflected the emperor's simultaneous distrust and dependence. The general fought a shadow campaign for 5 years, achieving tactical victories that could not compensate for strategic abandonment. He briefly recaptured Rome in 547, only to lose it again, then recaptured it once more in 548, in campaigns that epitomize futility, the same cities changing hands repeatedly, each occupation further devastating civilian populations caught between competing forces. The climactic degradation came in 549 when Justinian recalled Belisarius permanently, ending his military career not with triumph, but with dismissal. The Gothic War continued under other commanders for another 14 years, finally concluding in 554, not through military genius, but through attrition and the expenditure of resources that bankrupted the empire. The eunuch General Narses, granted the troops and authority Belisarius had repeatedly requested, achieved final victory that validated Belisarius's strategic vision, while simultaneously highlighting how Justinian's paranoia had unnecessarily prolonged the conflict and multiplied its costs. Belisarius's final years trace a trajectory from hero to tragic figure that parallels Rome itself. In 562, incredibly, Justinian briefly recalled him to military service, one last time to repel a Bulgar raid threatening Constantinople. The elderly general, probably approaching 60 years old, defeated the barbarians in his final campaign, demonstrating that his tactical brilliance remained intact even as his political favor crumbled entirely. The most persistent legend surrounding Belisarius's end that Justinian blinded him and reduced him to beggary appears to be medieval fabrication rather than historical fact. Yet the legend's persistence across centuries suggests emotional truth transcending literal accuracy. The general who had restored imperial frontiers through genius and bloodshed, who had massacred 30,000 in Constantinople and conquered kingdoms in Africa and Italy, died in 565, possibly stripped of honors, certainly marginalized and diminished, his legacy already contested. Justinian survived him by only 8 months, dying in November 565, leaving an empire territorially expanded, yet strategically exhausted, temporarily restored, yet fundamentally weakened. His restoration project a magnificent failure that accelerated the very decline it sought to reverse. Within a generation of Justinian's death, the Restoration Empire collapsed with stunning rapidity. The Lombards invaded Italy in 568, seizing most of the peninsula and reducing Roman control to coastal enclaves around Ravenna and Rome, Persian. Armies overran the eastern provinces in the early 7th century, most catastrophically Arab Islamic conquests between 632 and 642 permanently stripped away Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, the very territories whose reconquest had consumed Justinian's treasury and Belisarius's genius. By 650, the Mediterranean world Belisarius had died, restoring existed only as historical memory, its passing hastened rather than prevented by the wars fought in Rome's name. The human cost defied calculation but left archaeological evidence. Italy's population, perhaps 7 million under Theodoric, may have fallen to 2 or 3 million by 600 in Domini. According to demographic studies compiled by modern historians, including Chris Wickham in his comprehensive work, framing the early Middle Ages, cities shrank to fortified hilltops. Classical infrastructure collapsed into ruin. Literacy declined precipitously outside monasteries and episcopal courts. The Gothic War's devastation surpassed anything barbarian invasions had inflicted, proving that civil war between competing claimants to Roman legitimacy caused more destruction than barbarian conquest ever had. North Africa's trajectory proved equally catastrophic. The Berber tribes Belisarius had nominally subdued revolted repeatedly between 540 and 560, forcing Rome to maintain expensive garrisons that drained resources needed elsewhere. When Arab armies arrived in the mid-7th century, they conquered in years what Rome had spent decades trying to hold. The ancient cities of Roman Africa, Carthage, Hippo, Leptis, Magna declined into archaeological sites, their classical heritage erased more thoroughly than the Vandals had ever attempted. Belisarius himself occupied an ambiguous position in subsequent memory. Byzantine sources alternated between hagiography and condemnation. Procopius wrote both an official history celebrating his victories and a secret history, alleging incompetence and cowardice. Medieval writers transformed him into a moral exemplar, the loyal general betrayed by an ungrateful emperor. Though this legend simplified a far more complex relationship of mutual dependence and distrust, Western European sources largely ignored him, focused instead on the devastation his campaigns inflicted on Italy and the resentment of populations who experienced Roman liberation as occupation more brutal than barbarian rule. Modern historical assessment acknowledges Belisarius's tactical brilliance while questioning the strategic wisdom of the campaigns he executed. His ability to achieve victory against superior numbers through mobility, deception, and personal leadership places him among history's great battlefield commanders. Yet these tactical victories served a fundamentally flawed strategic vision: Justinian's restoration. Project ignored economic reality, demographic decline, and the transformed nature of the post-Roman world. Belisarius proved the perfect instrument for an impossible policy, his genius enabling just enough success to justify continued investment in enterprises that could never succeed sustainably. The tragedy extends beyond individual failure to systemic delusion. Justinian and Belisarius both operated from the assumption that military force could reverse historical transformation, that sufficient violence and determination could resurrect institutional forms whose material and demographic foundations had eroded irreversibly. Their wars consumed the resources needed to defend the empire's core territories, weakened the very populations they claimed to liberate, and created military burdens that successors could not sustain. Perhaps the darkest legacy involves the moral compromises required by restoration. The massacre at the Hippodrome, the devastation of Italian cities, systematic violence against populations resisting liberation. These atrocities were not unfortunate accidents but necessary prerequisites for the restoration project. Belisarius could not have achieved his victories through humane methods, and Justinian's vision could not accommodate moral limitations. They proved that trying to resurrect Rome required destroying what remained of Roman civilization, that restoration through violence created only the illusion of continuity while accelerating genuine transformation. The final irony, within 3 centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire would abandon Latin language, officially embrace Greek identity, and explicitly reject Western territorial ambitions. Becoming the Byzantine Empire, Greek Orthodox state that preserved Roman political structures while abandoning Roman cultural pretensions, this transformation, which Justinian had desperately resisted, enabled survival for another 8 centuries, suggesting that accepting historical change rather than violently resisting it might have served Roman continuity better than Belisarius's brilliant feudal campaigns ever could.